In our series of developing material for registered behavior technician license, continuous measurement is a very important topic. Continuous measurement is measuring every occurrence of behavior. How do we measure? What are our tools? Frequency, rate, duration, latency, inter-response time, trials to criterion, and percentage of occurrence are very important to be understood. The important thing is to remember about continuous measurement that you're measuring every occurrence of behavior. Contrast that to the discontinuous measurement where we are taking a sample of behavior or we are only measuring during a certain interval of behavior. With continuous measurement, if you work an entire day, you are measuring throughout the entire day. 3 hour sessions is 3 hour session. You get the idea? So let's start with the frequency. Frequency is the simplest and the easiest to understand. It is based on the number of responses because you're simply counting how many times something occurs. If I touch my nose 5 times, the frequency is 5. If there are 3 tantrums during your session, the frequency is 3. Very straightforward. You can use telemarks, clicker counters, iPhone app counter, or even you can count in your head, though I don't recommend that. It's not as accurate as using an actual tool, but it is the simplest way to measure anything. Frequency is just one component of rate. Frequency and rate are not the same thing. They are used interchangeably very often, but they are not the same. Frequency measurement is most appropriate when 4 statements A, B, C, and D. Let's evaluate them. A. You need to know how long a behavior lasted. In frequency, we are not bothered about the duration, how long the behavior lasted, but we are focused on how many times the behavior existed. B. The response has a clear beginning and an end, which is very important because when you're measuring the frequency, you need to count the number of times. When we are focusing on the number of times, it should have a clear beginning and a very clear end. C. The behavior happens at an extremely high rate. Again, rate is not our focus when we are counting the frequency, the number of occurrences. D. That you want to know the time in between the response. Certainly not, because in frequency, we are not looking at the time between the responses. So frequency is a very important component and an important tool of measurement. Rate. Frequency by time. Rate combines frequency and time. Get your frequency and divide it by the amount of time. It provides you the rate. For example, frequency is 30 over a 3 hour session. That means a child responded 30 times in a desired way in a period of 3 hours. So 30 divided by 3 is 10. 10 per hour. That is what is the rate. The client said 5 words yesterday and 7 words today. This is a measurement of rate, frequency, IRT, or duration. So what we're talking about is 5 words yesterday and 7 words today is actually an example of frequency, that he did 5 words yesterday, so the frequency was 5 words, and today he did 7 words, so the frequency today is 7. And if we want to take out the average of the frequency, it will be 5 plus 7, which is 12 divided by 2. So the average frequency is 6. So if we are looking at average frequency, that makes it a rate. That the rate of development of correct words is increasing from 5 to 7, but on an average, the rate remains 6. So the next tool in measurement is duration. How long a response lasts. Measure from the beginning to the end of a response. So when did the behavior start and when did the behavior end? Starting to the end is called duration. It's purely based on time. You start eating at 12 p.m. You finish eating at 12:30 p.m. The duration for which you were eating is 30 minutes. The client works for 20 minutes. The duration of the session is 20 minutes. The tantrum lasted for 5 minutes. So the duration of the tantrum is 5 minutes. So we clearly understand that duration is tapped with a stopwatch, with a timer, where we observe the time clear cut from the beginning till the end. Let's see an example. A client's tantrum lasted 10 minutes, 20 minutes, and 30 minutes. What is the total duration? So 10 minutes plus 20 minutes plus 30 minutes make it 60 minutes. So what is the total duration? Is 60 minutes. What is the independent duration of each tantrum? It is different. In one, it was 10. The second one, it was 20 minutes. And the third one, it was 30 minutes. So duration can be added on to find out the total duration of the tantrum in mathematical terms, practically adding every single duration. The next tool is latency. Amount of time between the SD and the start of a response. Discriminative stimulus followed by a response. Instructions and the response begins. So end of instruction, starting of response, the time between that is called latency. So you asked a child, stand up. Up, you start a stopwatch. The time the child takes to stand up is called the response. So say 2 seconds. That is what is the latency. So latency is totally based on time. Now, you give an instruction, the response 1 occurs, and then response 2, and then probably response 3. SD to response 1 is 2 seconds, that is what is latency. But response 1 to response 2 is 10 seconds, and that is called inter-response time. So students, be clear that latency is different from inter-response time. Inter-response time is a gap between the two consecutive responses, whereas latency is a gap between SD, the discriminative stimulus, and the beginning of the response. Now, let's understand it with an example. Contestants on Jeopardy needs to answer within 2 seconds of a question being asked in order to have a chance at winning. What are we measuring? So while the question is asked and the answer is given, the gap between that should be 2 seconds. So when the moment they ask the question, the contestants should not take more than 2 seconds to start answering. This is a very clear example of latency. It is not the duration. We are not interested to tap how long do they give the answer. Neither it is an inter-response time. There are no two responses and what is the frequency, and neither it is frequency because we are not tapping the number of times the contestant is trying to answer. So the only measuring tool out here is latency. Our next tool is inter-response time, IRT. The amount of time between the end of the response and the start of the next response. So say the child is responding 3 times. Response 1, response 2, response 3. So between R1 and R2 is an IRT. What is the time taken between that? R2 to R3 is again IRT. So it is totally based on time. I once again repeat that latency is from discriminative stimulus to the beginning of the response, whereas IRT is the gap between two consecutive responses. All right, let's take an example for inter-response time. It took the student 5 minutes to start his exam. The student took 30 seconds from question 1 to 2, 20 seconds from question 2 to 3, and 30 seconds from 3 to 4. What is the average IRT? Before going on to the average IRT, let's see what is the IRT for each question. So question 1 to 2, the inter-response time is 30 seconds. From question 2 to 3, the inter-response time is 20 seconds. And question 3 to 4, the inter-response time is 30 seconds. So the total is 30 plus 20 plus 30 is 80. 80 divided by what? 3 trials. So 80 divided by 3 is 27 seconds. So what is the average IRT? The average IRT is 27 seconds. So it's very important to understand IRT is a very important concept, an important tool of measurement to understand whether the child is progressing, learning, improving or not. Percentage of occurrence. Number of response divided by the number of opportunities. You ran 10 trials with your client and they answered correctly 6 times. The percentage of occurrence for the correct answer was 6 out of 10, that is 60%. How many times did something happen and how many opportunities were given? So how many opportunities were given? 10. How many times the child responded correctly? 6. So 6 over 10 becomes the percent of occurrence. Now let's try to understand it with an example. Over the course of an hour, you observe instances of your client saying no. The first 3 times the stakeholder asks the client something, the client says no. The next 2 times, the client says, I am ignoring you. What was the percent of occurrence of no? Now, let's try to understand this very clearly. That out of 5 occurrences, 3 times the client said no. And 2 times he said, I am ignoring you. So that means 3 divided by 5. So out of 5, it was 3 times. And if we multiply it by 100, so it is 60% of the time it was the Answer no. So, creating and calculating percentage as a tool for an RBT is a very important tool. So, what was the percentage? 60%. In any question, when we calculate the percentage, we actually standardize it and then we understand it better in comparative terms. So, on everyday basis, whether it is 3 times no, or 2 times no, or 5 times no, numbers may vary, but if you put it on the same footing of the percentage, it becomes an easy measurement tool. Let's take another example of percent. How do we calculate it? So, say you had put in your refrigerator 20 bottles of a drink and you consumed 16. Now, what percentage of the drink bottles did you consume? 16 out of 20 multiplied by 100. The answer is 80%. So you consumed 80%. The same question can be twisted and asked, what percentage of the drink bottles are not consumed? What would you do? There were 20. You consumed 16. How many bottles left? 4. 4 divided by 20 multiplied by 100 becomes what percentage? It becomes 20%. So whenever you're calculating a percentage or whenever there is a question in your RBT license exam, be very careful to understand whether they're talking about existing or they are focusing on the leftover. So there you need to use subtraction and then calculate the percentage. Trials to criterion. How many opportunities did it take to achieve mastery is a very important concept of measurement. It took your client 8 tries to reach the mastery. You can set your own criterion. Example, you want your client to answer correctly 3 times in a row. It takes your client 12 tries to answer 3 times correctly in a row. So you need to understand what is your criterion. Suppose we go for an example. Which of the following sequence represent the criterion of 4 successful trials out of 100% in a row? A, 90, 100. 90, 100. 100, 100. Only 3 consecutive hundreds in a row we got. This is not an example because we are looking for 4 times 100 in a row. Let's go and evaluate B. 100, 80. 80, 100. 80, 90, 100, 100. So the maximum in B, 2 consecutive hundreds in a row are achieved, which is not our criterion. Let's evaluate C. 40, 100. 100, 100. 100, 50. Oh yes. So we got 4 consecutive 100% in a row. D. 60%, 100%. 100%, 100%. 30%, 100%. So in this we have 3 consecutive 100%, but we do not have 400%. So when we talk about a criterion which we set, that need to be observed. So in this question, C is the right answer. So to conclude the continuous measurement, we need to understand that the continuous measurement is done continuously throughout the session. The session can be 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, depending upon how long are you working. What you need to know, Fifth, the most accurate measurement is the continuous measurement because it is not done on a sample, it is done on an actual situation. Number two, it requires more time and certainly more resources. Number three, what are our continuous measurements, which we all just understood? The rate, frequency. Frequency is the number of times, rate is number of times divided by the time. So per time occurrence. Duration is the duration of from the beginning to the end of any behavior. Inter-response time is between two responses, the time. Again, it is in terms of duration. We observe the time. Latency is SD to the response. So the minute your discriminative stimulus stops and your response starts, that time is called latency. Percent of occurrence. Percentage is very important in every set of measurement. So how do you calculate it? If out of 5 trials, 2 out of 100, how many? So every time 2 divided by 5 trials multiplied by 100, depending upon what are you measuring. And of course the trial of criteria, which is very important that we set the criterion. We say 3 consecutive corrects or 5 consecutive corrects. That is up to us to decide. But we take n number of trials to reach those continuous corrections. So we say 3 consecutive right response. If it takes us 10 trials to reach those 3 consecutive correct responses, that is what becomes our trials to correction. So with this we conclude continuous measurement, and our next series is on discontinuous measurement.